Professor Alicia Volk is professor of Japanese art at the University of Maryland. She is the author of Made in Japan, the Post-War Creative Print Movement, 2005, and curator of the exhibition of the same name. Her award-winning book, In Pursuit of Universalism, Yorozu Tetsugoro, and Japanese Modern Art, 2010, received the Phillips Book Prize. In the Shadow of Empire, Art in Occupied Japan, University of Chicago Press, 2025, is her latest book. Volk has been a Japan Foundation Ishibashi Foundation Fellow, a J. Paul Getty Postdoctoral Fellow, a Robert and Lisa Sainsbury Fellow at the School of African and Asian Studies of the University of London, and a Fulbright Research Fellow at Waseda University in Tokyo. She is currently a visiting senior fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Professor Franziska Seraphim is a historian of modern and contemporary Japan, as well as the director of the Asian Studies program at Boston College. Her work is focused on the contested place of Japan's empire and war in Asia in post-war politics, society, and culture. Her first book, War Memory and Social Politics in Japan, 1945 through 2005, came out from Harvard in 2006 and mapped out the landscape of war memory activism across the political spectrum. More recently, she co-edited with Helen Hardacre, Keigo Komamura, and Tim George the book Civic Activism on Japanese Constitutional Revision, and she contributed the chapter on social movements to the new Cambridge History of Japan, Volume 3, edited by Laura Hine. Among other publications relevant to tonight's talk, she has two articles in the Asia Pacific Journal Japan Focus, one on the Hanaoka Massacre, and the second, People's Diplomacy, the Japan-China Friendship Association and Critical War Memory in the 1950s. Franziska is currently writing a social history of the Allied Transitional Justice Program after World War II from a global and comparative perspective. Titled Geographies of Justice, it relates the different spatialities of the program and its transformation through the 1940s and 1950s through the lens of Japanese and German war criminals, prisons from their vast spread across Asia and Europe to the dynamics within the American-run jails in Tokyo and Landsberg in Bavaria, and the international and national politics of clemency. So with that, I turn the program over to Professor Volk, and I will try to make sure that her image is the one that pops up most forefront.
Thank you so much. I am very grateful to the Modern Japan History Association for giving me this opportunity to share my book, In the Shadow of Empire, and also for welcoming art historians like myself with open arms. I want to thank Franziska Seraphim for joining me in conversation this evening or morning, depending on where we may be, and also for being such an inspiration with her own scholarship. Emer O'Dwyer for moderating, thank you. And also everyone here for taking time out of your busy schedules. In these very uncertain times for research and education, more than ever, I cherish these precious opportunities for us to share our work with one another. Now, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the book, if I can get my PowerPoint started. Give me just one moment. And Emer, I'm just going to share my screen. Is that correct?
Yes, you should be co-host. So
right.
There you are. It's coming
Does that
up.
look okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Yes. Oh, thank goodness. Okay. All right. So I'll introduce my book, give a little walkthrough that I hope reveals why, of all topics, I thought it was important to tackle this one. In the introduction, I explain the complicated dynamics of occupied Japan, important especially for an art historical audience that, specialist or not, has had few, if any, opportunities to consider the art of this time and place. I reflect on why this art has largely been absent from art historical narratives in and out of Japan. Finally, I argue for opening up new interpretive horizons beyond an imperial American or Cold War gaze. Simply put, what can we see when we look with different eyes? For example, this aerial photograph and small pair of folding screens are visual expressions of the power differential at the heart of the occupation from the perspective of the victor. The screens were commissioned by an officer of the occupation and present a rosy, really highly selective view of the capital under American occupation, tucking the era's many conflicts out of sight as if under wisps of golden cloud. In a similar vein, I argue, if we consider art only from the perspective of the victor's art histories, much, like the art featured in the book, will remain hidden in the shadows, and in particular, those artworks that reveal the contested nature of geopolitical alignments that would later appear inevitable. So the book recuperates the point of view of the occupied, from the ground, so to speak, and in the ruins. I offer the ruins as a metaphor for the period and its art, because like the physical ruins, literal traces of the past, Japanese art of the immediate post-war was inherently trans-war in nature. It was also characterized by ambivalence and contradiction. In fact, like other cultural arenas, art was a battleground on which struggles over competing visions of peace, freedom, and democracy played out. This picture asks us to step into the shoes of a disheveled everyman, and face the conundrum of the new democratic age. Which way to go, as is indicated by the work's title. It is with this question in mind that I approach the artworks featured in the chapters ahead. That is, as strategically situated along a historically conditioned horizon of aesthetic and political possibilities. Finally, I discuss methodology, offering both the archive and the incommensurable as means of recuperating art that has languished in the long shadows of empire. So first, a few words on the archive. This project required many years, really an embarrassing number of years of archival research, which I conducted in the vast holdings of the Gordon W. Prang collection at my home institution of the University of Maryland, which houses the entire corpus of the occupation censorship operation of printed materials, some 1.7 million Japanese documents. And I think I should say that Prang Collection curator Kana Jenkins, I believe, is with us tonight. My book would not have been possible in its current form without her heroic assistance, especially in the dark days of the pandemic. We see a picture of her leading a group of my students through the archive on the screen right now. I made numerous discoveries, too, in the occupation records at the National Archives, which revealed the perspective of the occupiers. Ironically, it is because of its imperial origins that the archive of occupied Japan is so comprehensive. Yet, as the book shows, the archive also holds the potential to craft alternative narratives that work against the mechanisms of empire that led to its amassing in the first place. In a second methodological argument, I advocate for the incommensurable as a productive, if often overlooked, mode of relationality, for getting at some of the most challenging blind spots of art history and its framing of what is often called non-Western art. Globally minded art histories, which by and large omit the occupation, have prioritized art that demonstrates engagement and commensurability with canonical, so that would mean, in this case, Euro-American art histories, thereby reinscribing geopolitical hierarchies that were forged in this very time period. I argue, on the other hand, for the value of exploring art characterized by disengagement and incommensurability. In the case of Japan, this perspective allows us to actually see art made under the conditions of American geopolitical dominance that has been rendered invisible or illegible. And as I happily discovered, this perspective may also point to unexpected transnational relationalities and remarkable, if forgotten, possibilities for art and expression. So how did art respond to war and defeat? In the first chapter, I examine the art world from a trans-war perspective, mapping out its various wings and describing the artistic and political stakes of the democratic reform of art. I begin by highlighting wartime efforts at unification with a focus on artists' participation in the 2600th anniversary of the founding of the empire and the big art exhibition that went along with that. Moving to the early post-war, I show how art was colored by the war's lingering presence and characterized as much by continuity as by discontinuity. Then, focusing on the Japan Art Association, a group of artists of diverse inclinations that would come under the influence of the Communist Party, I show how experimental collectives work to avoid the pitfalls of existing artist groups, especially the anti-establishment Zaya groups that during wartime had succumbed to the totalitarian state. I discuss how artists on the liberal left reflected on the failures of the recent past, On the one hand, by taking up the issue of war responsibility, and on the other, by securing artistic autonomy. Artists embraced the exhibition, especially in a non-juried and independent form, as a site for realizing the meaningful confluence of artwork, artist, and audience in a democracy. Art world tensions escalated with the occupation's reverse course. I show how the reverse course was the impetus for the emergence of an activist art movement, a theme expanded upon in later chapters. This painting by Uchida Iwao, for example, heroizes the labor struggle at the Toho movie studios and epitomizes the ambitions of artists on the far left. By this point in 1948, the avant-garde, which was at first loosely unified, had become sharply divided into two blocks: modernists working in surrealism and abstraction for the most part, and leftists like Uchida working in what were seen as more accessible realist or figurative modes. The themes of war responsibility, autonomy, and the fracturing of the avant-garde that I introduce in Chapter 1 are brought to the more idiosyncratic story of the painter Fukuzawa Ichiro in Chapter 2. This chapter is an extended analysis of his painting Monument to Defeat in War. And this painting, some of you may know, was on display until last week at the National Gallery of Art in Tokyo in Takebashi as part of their recent war-related exhibition. Taken together with Uchida's Come Sing Along, Fukuzawa's canvas reveals the tensions that existed between liberal modernist and radical leftist artistic positions and the stakes of their respective endeavors. I place the work in Fukuzawa's oeuvre from the 1930s through the late 40s to show how the painting was a response to the forced tenko, or ideological conversion, he underwent during the war, and to the issue of war responsibility more generally. These themes are explored in the many images that form his ambitious early post-war series inspired by Dante's Inferno. And the work is also put in dialogue with its wartime precursors. I argue that Fukuzawa cited such precedents to expose the troubling reemergence of fascism under the guise of democracy in the early post-war. And I show how these trans-war themes, encapsulated in the notion of ruins, animate this distinctly anti-monumental monument to defeat. So each of the remaining chapters from this point on put the competing artistic strategies and political positions outlined in the first two chapters into dialogue. Two contradictory trajectories for the print are taken up in Chapter 3. Here I demonstrate the dynamic interplay between modernist and populist artistic positions. By bringing creative prints and people's prints into dialogue, this chapter reveals the political stakes of artistic expression amid polarizing Cold War alignments. Modernist creative prints were eagerly consumed by American occupiers. They would eventually play an important role in Japan's self-identification as a nation of culture. Onshi Koshiro, whose work we see here, is the paradigmatic artist, and his practice is given sustained attention. Populist people's prints were in a very different political and aesthetic vein, oriented toward cultural revolution and the communist sphere. People's print artists brought prints and printmaking to factory workers and rural laborers. They wished to expand the authorship of art while also serving the labor and peace movements. I show how creative prints were the impetus for the divergent directions pursued by creative and people's prints from around 1948. These manifested, on the one hand, in large, bold, and sometimes singular abstract prints, and on the other, with collaboratively produced figurative images meant to empower workers in their labor struggles, such as this mimeographed book made at Hitachi. The chapter concludes with Japanese artist engagement with art worlds on either side of the Cold War divide. So, whether cultivating free world patrons and audiences or pursuing transnational solidarities through a communist-aligned peace movement. And it also considers the impact of these transnational alignments on their place in art history. The focus shifts to sculpture and public monuments in Chapter 4, where I take up the role of peace monuments in the fraught endeavor of remembering and forgetting the recent war. I consider the changing landscape of public monuments, So for example, in Hibiya Park, the image we see on the left, Naval March Memorial, was removed by the occupying authorities for its nationalism and replaced several years later by the Goddess of Liberty. Through these and other examples, I show how sculpture manifested conflicting notions of peace and freedom. No object was more emblematic of Japan's rocky transition into the American sphere than Voices of the Sea, the focus of the rest of the chapter. The statue was a memorial to the student war dead, a resting place for their spirits, and a call to action for the living. And as you can see from these comparisons here, it was also strongly influenced by a humanistic tradition in European sculpture, as represented by the works of Rodin and Michelangelo, and also designed in contradistinction to the type of sculpture produced during wartime by Kitamura Seibo, for example, in his image we see here, cast later but designed during the war of Kamikaze Pilot. Unlike other monuments to peace, the statue was embedded in the student and peace movements. I show how, in response to the Red Purge, the Korean War, Japanese rearmament, and the peace treaty, it exposed the incongruities of peace, freedom, and democracy in the final years of the occupation. And as a flashpoint in these and related issues into the 60s, Voices of the Sea often found itself in dramatic and sometimes violent encounters. In Chapter 5, I demonstrate how women artists sought to capture the potential of social and political change at this transformative historical moment. The narrative is focused on Migishi Setsuko and Akamatsu Toshiko, two of the most active and successful women painters. I put their divergent stances toward artistic autonomy and authorship into dialogue to consider how their experiences as women artists informed their painting and politics. In this way, the tension between modernism and populism that we see in earlier chapters is reprised. Migishi was admired for her still lifes, showing the influence of the French painter Georges Braque, while Akamatsu partnered with her husband Maruki Iri in the creation of the atomic bomb pictures. My comparative analysis reveals how women artists across the spectrum of artistic practice and political conviction engaged in efforts both to realize women's liberation and to democratize art. The concluding chapter opens with a pair of artworks from the time of the signing of the peace and security treaties in 1951. They represent starkly divergent responses to Japan's new status quo as the U.S.'s junior partner in the Pacific. Akamatsu Toshiko's satirical illustration, Goddess of Liberty, This is Peace, rails against the pretense of peace and freedom under America's nuclear wing. By contrast, Inokuma Genichiro's Freedom, which I suspect many of you have seen at Ueno Station in Tokyo, suggests the emptying out of the revolutionary potential of the ideal of freedom. I argue that it celebrates the satisfying of hunger, rest from labor, and pursuit of leisure, all benefits of Japan's newly secured independence. A third artwork, Suzuki Kenji's woodcut Occupation of the People's Plaza, which immortalized the violent confrontation known as Bloody May Day, is shown to capture the tensions and contradictions that would continue to animate post-occupation Japan, a unique site within the American Imperium. My study of art in occupied Japan takes an episodic and dialogic approach to present a fluid map of positionality. Across a wide range of practice and medium, it uncovers artistic and political solidarities and frictions between actors and camps of various aesthetic and ideological commitments. By putting a diverse selection of artists and artworks into dialogue within and across chapters, I sought to capture an expansive sense of the moment's horizon of opportunity, as well as its horizon of limitation. Ultimately, the book shows that in this early Cold War context, what emerged was an expanded and contested notion of art itself. Well, I hope I have managed to whet your appetite with these comments. Thank you so much for your attention. I welcome your questions, your comments, and also your criticisms. I think I will hand it over to Franziska. Franziska, if you would like me to stop sharing, I'm happy to do that. Or I can keep the PowerPoint on if you'd like to refer to any of the images.
Yeah, so perhaps just keep it on.
Okay,
I mean, you could take it off for just a few minutes if you're willing to put
sure.
it back on again, if that's too
Okay,
complicated. So just so we can see you properly. No.
okay.
Thank you so much for this. That was really an extraordinarily well done, condensed,
Super condensed.
nugget of what this book really is about. And I think I would like to invite us to just really radically slow down now, now that
Mm,
we have the overview, and actually take time and look at some of these images
mm,
with your guidance. At least that's what I would love to do. I think that will give people a really good you know, view now that we have the overview of just the kind of work that you have done for us with this book. And I admire it deeply, and I am so grateful that I used it in my class this semester that you came and spoke at BC. It was really wonderful. And I usually do read the student newspaper diligently, but since coming back from Japan, I'd had no time and I skipped this last one. And so I didn't see that the students had actually written up your lecture. So thank you for finding that first. It tells you something about, what an impression you've made. Let me begin before we go back to some images with just a few, small things perhaps, but I would like you to say a bit more about the title. And that is so evocative. Uh, and it is left ambiguous, and anybody who is a Japanese historian knows exactly what you mean, But I wanted to hear from you just
mm,
how that has played, how just say more about not so much what you mean by the title,
mm.
um, but how that title actually is perfect for this book.
I struggled quite a bit with the title, as I imagine many of us do for our books. But uh, the idea of shadow is really important to me, and I think hopefully in my comments, which mention art history a lot, right? So I'm very keen to interact with my discipline's history and its existing canons and kind of assumptions and biases and whatnot, and so, as my work as a historian of Japanese art, of modern Japanese art, which is a field that is relatively new, just some decades old now. Um, I am always thinking about the place of Japanese art within the space of the larger discipline. So whether that's, art history in general or histories of modern or modern and contemporary art. So where does Japan and Japanese art fit there? And so looking at the art of the occupation offered a really good opportunity, I think, to look at the formation of my discipline and the place of Japanese and other art within it in relationship to the moment of the occupation when the American Empire really was ascendant and the Japanese Empire ended. And so it's a body of work that I study that really doesn't make sense according to dominant paradigms for understanding art, which have been based upon those larger geopolitical frameworks that were set into place at this very time. So in both Japanese and American art, and or English language art history, or art histories of Japanese art written outside of Japan and in Japan, Japanese art from this time period really doesn't figure. And I was interested in exploring why. And so I didn't start with the idea of empire necessarily. It was one that I uncovered in the process of understanding these artworks. And so it's really trying to bring to light those objects or stories that uh, have been buried because of the difficulties of excavating this period. Does that make sense, Franziska?
Oh no, but these and the overlapping empires, right? And
Right.
some, one is on the decline and going away, but the other one is picking up. And yet the art world has to make sense of both, right? So it's both a looking back to
Mm,
the war and wrestling with a present that is in some ways echoing certain aspects of the past. And I mean, it's really that conundrum that I think so many of us who deal with the occupation time wrestle with. But you are able to view it. You are able to look at images and see how that wrestling is taking place in real time. So that, in many ways, I don't think we learn great new things about the history of the occupation in terms of its politics, right? But I'm also really grateful, very grateful for how well and how concise you frame that, the body of what we know. And now you let the images speak. So that's just, it's really quite extraordinary how that works. I thought that perhaps, actually, maybe you can say a few more words about how you came to this. I understand that both of us lived in Japan in the mid-90s. You were then going a slightly different way, but you all in some ways returned to it. Can you say a little bit more about that formative time?
Yes. So before going to graduate school, so after my undergraduate years, I went to Japan to prepare for graduate school. And I was woefully ignorant of Japanese art. I had studied Japanese language and culture and modern art, but not Japanese art. So I went with a really open mind, saw lots of amazing art at this time, and I was really struck in particular by how much of the discourse at the time, but also in art, but also just in general in the news and in society at the time, was about the impending anniversary of World War II. And as a very young American, I was maybe 21 at the time, I really couldn't understand why everybody was talking about the past. I mean, it was like ancient history. I associate it with my grandfather. And so I became really curious about how the past, one that I thought was, light years away, was so present and so immediate in the lived experiences of the Japanese at that time. And I think that was probably really the seed for my interest in this period and in the complicated relationships between Japan and the United States since the Second World War, if not earlier, of course. But yeah.
So allow me to perhaps spend less or no time on the war itself, even though that too is super interesting, of course, right? But to go straight into the post-war. So in some ways leave the first, substantive chapter out and rather look at these four fields of defeat and what that, how that is visualized, how that is wrestled with via a visual methodology. Then responses to the Cold War, war memory and peace, and the last one, liberation, in terms, especially women's liberation. And how in each of these fields you are able to excavate via juxtaposing different artists or seeing it within one artist, the wrestling itself. And but before we go there, I thought I'd give you the opportunity to just speak about what many of us feel. It's kind of a revelatory thing, and that is the what's I don't even remember the name of the artist, although I have it written down. The screens, the mini screens that were that MacArthur had made, so to speak,
Of course.
that shows Tokyo in the ruins, without the ruins. No. So an American perspective, just so we have it put on the table and we can move on and away from it.
Would you like me to pull up the image?
I think it would be great.
Yeah. Okay. So let me
It's
do
just
that
so
once
stunning that
again.
something like this exists, and it's here in Boston at the MFA, and most of us didn't know about it.
Well, they are works that have not been studied before, so it's not surprising if if you're not aware of it. I'm sorry. Oh, totally in the wrong place.
It's early on.
I should have done this before I had the PowerPoint in front of everyone's eyes. My apologies, everyone. It's not very
Oh, here
comfortable.
we are.
Okay.
Can you make it bigger? I don't know. Maybe that's not possible.
I don't think it is at
Okay,
this
that's
point,
fine.
unfortunately. They're large screens, but by the standard of screens, they're not that large. They're quite petite. They're less than 2 feet tall and about 4 feet wide each. But they're crammed with tons of interesting details, painted in really very exquisite and expensive mineral pigments and gold. And so in the book, I discuss them as this very privileged and partial view of the American occupiers of occupied Tokyo in all of these sites that were requisitioned or otherwise symbolic and speaking to the power differential between MacArthur and the occupation administration and Japanese authority as emblematized by the imperial palace. So if you see in the right screen, the palace is at the far left, and to its right is GHQ with the American flag coming out of the clouds, and MacArthur is standing there on the steps of the building. So these are screens that are, I described it in my talk just now as rosy and very selective in the image that they reveal of occupied Tokyo. They leave out so much of the tensions and the conflicts and the protests even of the occupation, the material conditions that people lived through that were so very difficult at the time, and instead make this occupation seem this, kind of ideal space where everyone is prospering. And so for me, that was a very helpful way of understanding how perspective, whether this perspective of the victor or the perspective of the vanquished, can offer very different ways of understanding the lived experience of this time.
Mhm. I mean, what I found so, so stunning is that this is a US military commissioned work, right?
Mhm.
And yet it is a Japanese art style,
Oh, yes,
a
yes, yes,
classic one,
yes,
right?
yes,
That
yes.
uses gold leaf to hide whatever is not important, and so
Mhm.
to highlight better the areas that the painter wants to show you. So all
Right.
the rubble is just hidden, right?
Right. No, it
Gold leaf.
is fascinating because it is, a variation on a genre
That's right.
that was all about power, the warlord's gaze over the domain, in an earlier period of Japanese history, and the fact that an American officer, privately commissioned it, but nonetheless wanted to adopt that kind of viewpoint for an object for his own consumption, I think is really very fascinating. It's by a Nihonga artist, a traditionally trained painter who was on rough times,
Okay.
and is not, his whereabouts are basically not known after this point in time. So,
But it's interesting that they were called the MacArthur screens, even though it wasn't MacArthur who commissioned them, right?
right, right.
But he might as well.
You might as well. That's right.
So in
He's the star of the
contrast,
show.
yeah. So I mean, but it also just really sharpens our eye to, how to see and how to see critically, right?
Mhm.
Whose perspective. So perhaps next we could go to the two Japanese pieces, Matsumoto and Onchi, on Tokyo in ruins and at ruins. I
Oh,
think you
okay.
have them together. Yeah,
These right
right
next
here.
slide. Okay.
Because they are strikingly different. One
Mm.
is Tokyo in ruins a woodblock print?
So I don't believe
Looks
it's a
like it.
woodblock print. It was reproduced in this image is taken from a publication,
I
an
see.
obscure publication from northern Japan that's in the Prang collection today. It's a reproduction of an artwork.
I see.
So the original artwork seems to no longer survive, or at least if it does, I have not been able to find it.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
That explains that. Yeah.
Most likely a pen drawing. Yeah.
I see a pen drawing. Yeah. And then Onchi Koshiro's, which I think is absolutely stunning.
Mm.
And so I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit about, so these are the ruins now, right? One is more concrete than the other, but the other is also just stunningly explicit in many ways. I wonder whether you can illuminate that for us a little bit.
So a comparison with the other work, is that what you mean with the screens, or
Yeah,
just
those two, are very different in style.
oh, the two images here? Yes,
The two images that we
right,
have here.
right.
Um,
Well, Matsumoto Shinsuke was a relatively younger artist who was not conscripted during the war due to a physical disability, and so he was in the region of Tokyo and Yokohama during the air bombings, the air raids of the fire bombings of spring of 1945. And he would walk through the ruins and document them, lots of sketches in his sketchbooks, and some, also became oil paintings. I chose to show this work because I think it's very evocative in the sense of in how it conveys a sense of loss. There's this one standing wall, and we can imagine that all around it were many other walls of buildings and spaces populated by a community that's no longer there. And so it's I think a very graphically expressive image of the ruins. Um, Onchi's image, on the other hand, he puts the word allegory in its title, so he's really not documenting the ruins, but instead, creating an image to allegorize them. And so he chooses the naked female form, which is so this figure is levitating, and she's compressed between these two masses that rhyme, one at the top and one at the bottom. They're, these horizontal kind of bulbous shapes. The one at the bottom is evocative of what at the time was described as the scorched red earth of the firebombing. So I think the color red there is quite evocative or suggestive of the actual landscape. But she is kind of suspended between the earth and the sky, if the form above may be read as a cloud. And below her are the kind of remains of a civilization. So I read the head, that the bust that's fallen on its side as a form of civilization, of culture, probably of a monument or statuary. And the others as the other forms, as ruined buildings, and of course the very recognizable motif of the burnt out tree, which appears in so much of the photography, but also art from this time. And she's neither falling to the ground nor rising above. She's kind of suspended in a state of irresolution that I think was very much in tune with the despair or weariness, the kyodatsu that Onchi and other artists uh, and the population at large felt at this time. And Onchi himself described the ruins as a monument to weariness. He saw them as moving and breathing. And so he really thought about them in this, a very expansive sense.
yeah. I just find it stunning. Also, the horizontality in both of these images is striking to me.
Mm-hmm.
The other one of Matsumoto also has a lot of these horizontal
That's right.
lines. And then you have sort of the vertical one right at the center. And also the vertical in the charred tree in Onchi's piece that sticks up like a
That's right.
sore tooth and is met in some ways by her hair coming down.
Yeah.
So this, I think the play here with horizontality and then the verticality cuts through that.
Yeah, I think that's very
Interesting to
productive.
me.
Matsumoto's paintings are often extremely horizontal, very pronounced horizontality in terms of
Yeah.
their actual format as well, not just the picture, but the shape of the canvas, really emphasizing the, you know, the unending miles of destruction and how they can't really be captured within the space of a pictorial image or
Yeah, and also
imagination.
it's all but also it's just your heart drops when you see this. I mean, there's this devastation of the horizontality that kind of makes you feel there's hardly anything to do about this. It's I think it has a huge impression, makes a huge impression. I let's go to the Cold War ones, to the contradictions in the next chapter. And maybe one of Onchi and one Hiroharu. So one of the modernist prints and one of the
How's this?
yeah, maybe this one. Okay,
Okay.
great. I think this is what I had in mind, and discuss this a little bit. In terms of, I mean, what you're excavating in that chapter is the Cold War contradictions, really. Not only that people respond to the Cold War differently, but that the Cold War condition that Japan finds itself in bears contradictions. And I think you say in the epilogue at one point, you say something about that the charismatic objects of art expose the invisible structures, dynamics, and stakes of this formative moment. And I think it speaks to this chapter in particular, although it speaks to all of them. So one thing I want to mention is the charismatic part, nature of these images, and then the very different ways of responding, obviously coming from different political positions, very clearly, but also just drawing out different aspects. If you could talk a little bit about that, the modernist and the people's print.
Right. Well, I just want to say, first of all, that this was an incredibly rewarding chapter to research and also to write because although I had, experience researching and studying creative prints in the past, those prints that are found across, institutions, museums and private collections across this country, so easily, knowable. I hadn't had much experience with the populist people's prints. And so in writing this chapter, I delved into a world that became deeply meaningful, not only because of its newness, but because of how it really altered my way of understanding this entire period of of history, but of art making, whether prints or not. So I learned a lot of lessons from seeing how these print artists, over a period of just a handful of years, and in response to the the deepening of the Cold War, or its how it manifested in the lives of the Japanese between really 1947 and 1950, to see how these artists really began to take positions very clearly when maybe they weren't inclined to do so at the beginning, but by the end of this period, they had really settled into very distinct approaches to art and art making, including notions of authorship, of audience, the purpose and role of art in society. So they were really looking at very big and important questions for art making in a very serious manner. So the creative print artists, and I focus on Onchi. There are many print artists, and they all have different styles and different subjects. So there's a huge amount of variability, but they're united by their insistence on the individual artist's control over the image. So they're quite, they define themselves against traditional ukiyo-e practices or modern revivals of traditional ukiyo-e practices, and really want to make the print a serious and ambitious forum for individual expression in really a modernist sense. And so in Onchi's work, we see him really pushing the print in very interesting directions with abstraction, and with also like what a print could be and how it could be assembled. So he doesn't use a woodblock at all to make this print, which was quite rare at the time. He actually, he's the same artist who carved the and printed the image we saw of the levitating woman earlier. He went out into the streets and found all sorts of trash, as he called it, rubble and debris from the lives that had been destroyed by the war. And he then made impressions of various textured surfaces and forms, and put those impressions, inked the forms, and then impressed them onto the surface of the image. And so although there are a few variations of this artwork, they're really very distinct images meant to be seen as individual singular art objects. The people's print artists were defining themselves against creative prints. And so this idea of the individual artist, they wanted to jettison. The idea of the singular object, like an art object, they also wanted to say goodbye to. They were much more interested in using their art to help empower the people, and the people in particular to make their own culture, their own artistic culture as well. So their works, like as we see here with Nii Hiroharu's image of unemployed workers from Hitachi, they're very sympathetic to the workers and the suffering of workers in this period. But they also, and I don't show images here except for the Tale of Hitachi picture book, they move their art in directions more towards activist functionality in this world. So it's not about aesthetic appreciation. It's about what can the art object do to affect change as efficiently and productively as possible. And so you can see even in their use of materials, they're quite different. The stark monochrome of the people's prints against the more colorful and lyrical, poetic type of images that Onchi made.
Yeah. I mean, when I discovered the tale of Hanaoka Monogatari, also by Nii Hiroharu, because I studied the Nichu Yuko Kyokai, the Japan-China Friendship Association, that used those prints to, prominently in their paper. I mean, it was just such a revelation. And then seeing how that actually played off of Chinese resistance art in the 1930s in Shanghai. I mean, that was just, there are so many things coming together, the past, Japan's empire, and today at that time, resistance movements. It's the whole thing comes together in really potent ways. I'm so glad that you really fleshed that out for us.
Well, I just want to say as well that I was thrilled and shocked and surprised when I discovered how important Chinese prints were at this moment in time. They were the first real body of overseas contemporary art that made its way to Japan in the occupation. Artists were really thirsty for contact with others, working overseas and with developments in various locations. But the idea that it would be Chinese art, rather, the typical assumption is that it would be, American art, or Paris is always the center, right? So I was able to really see then how important the cultural and artistic production of the Chinese civil wars happening at this time and the communist revolution, and how important those were as sources to Japanese artists as well, and to find these two worlds that were coexisting and really engaging with one another. But the more they engaged, the more they pulled further apart. That was a really fascinating and unexpected development in my research.
And hugely important, I think. Emer, you are saying that we have about half an hour left. I would like to put up sort of one more example. Do we have time, or do you want to go to questions?
That's up to you and Alicia.
I
Maybe
think
I'm being too wordy in my responses. I'm
no,
sorry.
it's
Not at
perfect.
all.
It really is perfect. I think we should do one more. The question is which one? Do we want to do the sculpture or the feminists? In some ways, to my mind, the feminist movements, and especially Akamatsu or Maruki, as she's also known, docks onto this populist,
Mhm.
people's prints, even though they weren't prints. But there's a similar politics involved.
That's right.
Whereas the sculpture is really, I mean, I don't know what to do with that as much. I find that much more challenging. And
Could we look at
that
the sculpture then?
maybe we'll look at the sculpture, also because it's really different,
Hmm.
and how you weave that in. I mean, you already gave us a bit of an overview, but this is where the other part, the Western part, the French, influence
Hmm.
comes in more clearly.
Hmm.
But if you could pull up a slide that has at least Hongo Shin's, and yeah, this one,
Maybe
and
this one here.
maybe the one before the Hongo Shin, and yeah. So here we have several different ones. And then Kitamura Seibo, who made that atrocious Nagasaki memorial. Sorry
Mm.
about my judgmentalism, but I still can't get over that Nagasaki memorial that he made. Um, but if you could help us a little bit in understanding, I mean, I wrote about Hongo Shin's Wadatsumi Zoo, but I never quite understood it.
Mm. Well, I actually, so I'm glad we're looking at the image before its destruction that no longer exists, the first cast, the one we see on the left. But I really would like to look at this one here because
Okay,
I think
great.
this photograph of the statue really is better able to convey how unusual, how strange it was as a monument because it was intended for the University of Tokyo. It was denied by the University of Tokyo in this highly charged political context where it was, you know, maybe influenced by communist or would take some censure from the occupation or the Japanese authorities, and so they didn't want to have anything to do with it. And then it took on a second life as an activist artwork, and so. Bronze sculptures typically do not do this because they're heavy and they're large and they like to stay in one place. But this statue was carried around to all sorts of peace gatherings led by students and others during the years of the Korean War. And it was, an incredibly charismatic, again, object that was, deeply meaningful to those communities of students, of their mothers, the women's peace movement at this time. And it was so different from the work that we see on the left, which was a different peace monument. The two works that we see were actually both unveiled at the same moment in the same exhibition. The artists were in the same artist group, but the one on the left is a work that doesn't command the viewer's attention or ask very much of the viewer. It's a work that was appreciated as being beautiful. It was, to be sure, a little unusual to have three naked women on a pedestal in Tokyo at this time, but it didn't. It didn't stir up any kind of controversy at its site at Miyakizaka, and I think the work itself is very much meant to not ruffle any feathers. It's meant to have a certain type of aesthetic detachment, whereas the Hongoshin sculpture was deeply embedded within the politics of its moment.
And in terms of the look of these sculptures,
Mm,
as both war memory and peace, I mean, peace is always so fraught, right?
mm.
Um, I mean, it's just such a different modality, and it's I'm
Well,
not in. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that the statue is really very beautiful, and it's really trying to be beautiful, but it's something also that it was criticized for in the 60s, when a new generation criticized this early post-war generation and their peace activism, for its kind of uh, very forgetful sense of their own complicity in the war, and also for the aestheticization of those who were lost in the war. The statue itself is such a beautiful object. Here we see it destroyed at Itzemekan University, where it ended up in 1953 during student riots, because they didn't see it as a symbol of peace. At this point in time, they saw it as like a wrong-headed way of dealing with the issues of the past that it was meant to commemorate.
But this kind of the gesture too. One is fighting. One is no. But how is it again? I forget myself. So one is more contemplative, and one is fighting, right?
Yeah, you can read it that way. Yes, he's both, inward looking, but
Yeah.
also meant to suggest action at the same time.
Yeah. But his head is very much facing the contemplative
Yes.
aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that may also have been part of the 60s, issue with that. Yeah. A replica is now standing in the entrance of the Lithuanian Peace Museum. See it there.